firmly believe, I am convinced that the tomb of Cleopatra, there will not be any other place that reunites all the conditions at Taposiris Magna to
Cleopatra's own family history was wrong for 40 years, and nobody caught it until someone finally checked the DNA. A skull sitting in a museum archive was believed to be the last pharaoh's sister, a direct genetic bridge to Egypt's most famous queen. It wasn't. And what it actually turned out to be is stranger than anyone expected. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's real body has never been found at all, despite a 20-year excavation that just uncovered something nobody can fully explain. Here's what science actually found, and why it's more terrifying than the myth it replaced. To understand how any of this happened, the story has to start where every search for her always does, with a search that's never actually succeeded the tomb that's never been found. For over 2,000 years, the sand has kept one secret better than almost anything else in the ancient world. Where is she? A real, physical body belonging to one of the most famous human beings who ever lived, and after 2 millennia of searching, from independent treasure hunters to fully funded modern expeditions using satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, nobody has ever found her. You would think, by now, someone would have. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, didn't die in obscurity. She was the final ruler of a dynasty that had controlled the richest kingdom in the ancient Mediterranean for nearly 3 centuries. Her death wasn't a quiet disappearance. It was recorded, discussed, mourned, and mythologized within her own lifetime and every century since. And still, her body is gone. That gap between how famous her death was and how completely her body vanished is exactly where the real mystery starts. Most historians will tell you the simplest explanation, that she's buried somewhere beneath modern Alexandria, lost to earthquakes, to rising seawater, to 2,000 years of a city rebuilding itself directly on top of its own ruins. If that's true, she may never be found at all. Not because nobody's looking, because there may be nothing left to find. But here's the part that keeps this story alive. Not everyone accepts that answer. For 20 years, one team has been digging on the theory that the official explanation is wrong, that Cleopatra isn't lost beneath a city at all, and that she was never meant to be found by accident in the first place, that she was hidden, deliberately, by people who understood exactly what would happen if Rome ever got hold of her body. That theory has produced real excavations and real discoveries, including a tunnel that made archaeologists ask a question they didn't expect to be asking. Why would anyone go to this much trouble unless what's at the end of it was worth protecting at any cost? Whoever eventually finds that tomb won't just solve a 2,000-year-old mystery. They'll hold one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of this century in their hands. Nobody has yet. And the woman who spent 2 decades trying to change that didn't come to this search the way anyone expected. The real excavation at Taposiris Magna. Kathleen Martínez did not come to Egyptology through a university lecture hall. And that's part of what makes her 20-year obsession with this search so different from everything that came before it. She was a criminal lawyer from the Dominican Republic, trained to build a case out of evidence and the small details everyone else overlooks. When she turned her attention to Cleopatra, she didn't approach the question the way historians traditionally had, as an academic puzzle to be debated in journals. She approached it like an unsolved disappearance, a cold case that had simply gone cold for 2,000 years instead of 20. And cold cases, she understood better than most, get solved by people willing to look somewhere nobody else thought to check.
When I entered for the first time what is left of Taposiris Magna temple, I knew I was in the right place.
While most of the field kept its attention fixed on Alexandria, the ancient Egyptian city Cleopatra ruled from, and where most historians still believe she's buried, Martínez looked elsewhere entirely. Her search led her roughly 30 miles west, to a crumbling, largely forgotten temple complex called Taposiris Magna. It wasn't an obvious choice. For most of the 20th century, the site had drawn only modest scholarly interest, a minor temple on the edges of what most historians considered the real story. But Martínez didn't see it that way, and in 2022, the ground finally seemed to agree with her.
Tunnels, passages underground, a huge complex of tunnels that I've been excavating those tunnels for now 15 years, and I haven't finished.
Her team broke through the limestone and found something that, by any normal expectation, shouldn't have been there at all. A tunnel, and not a small side passage or a minor architectural curiosity, but a genuine engineering achievement. Carved directly through solid bedrock, stretching more than 4,300 feet, nearly a mile in total length. Roughly 6 feet high, partially submerged in mud and groundwater, running in a straight line toward the Mediterranean coastline. Architects and engineers who've studied it since have called it remarkable, comparing its design to legendary ancient tunnel building achievements from the broader Greek world. And that raises the obvious question anyone would ask standing at the mouth of it. Why go to this kind of trouble, this kind of precision engineering, 40 feet underground, through unstable rock, for a site most people had already written off as minor? Structures like this don't get built to protect something unimportant. The site kept giving up answers to that question. In 2025, Martínez's team identified a submerged ancient port just off the coast near the temple, evidence that Taposiris Magna wasn't the isolated, forgotten outpost history had assumed. It was connected, a working hub, not a quiet backwater. Inside the temple complex itself, the team uncovered something even stranger. 16 rock-cut tombs, holding mummies that had clearly not been treated as ordinary burials. When researchers examined the remains closely, they found gold placed inside the mouths of the dead. Where tongues should have been, were small amulets crafted from gold foil. Ancient Egyptians believed the dead needed to speak to be judged fairly in the afterlife, to plead their case before Osiris, lord of the underworld. A golden tongue was thought to grant the dead the power to do exactly that, to speak convincingly enough to be believed by a god. That detail matters because of what it implies about who these people actually were. Martínez's theory is that these weren't random local burials. These were people of status, possibly members of Cleopatra's own inner circle, buried with the exact ritual equipment required to formally greet a god or a queen in the afterlife. If that's true, this site isn't simply a graveyard. It may be something closer to a royal reception hall, a necropolis built to receive someone very specific. For the first time in 2,000 years, someone may have found the front door. That door, though, wasn't the only lead this search would eventually produce. Long before anyone reached this tunnel, a completely different set of bones had already convinced an entire field of scholars they'd found their answer somewhere else. The Sister Nobody was looking for that tunnel wasn't the only lead this 2,000-year search would eventually produce. A completely different set of bones, found on the other side of the Mediterranean, had already convinced generations of historians they'd found their answer somewhere else entirely. To understand how, you have to understand that Cleopatra's biggest threat was never a Roman general. It was her own sister. Her name was Arsinoe IV, and the relationship between the two of them had nothing resembling sisterly loyalty behind it. When Cleopatra was exiled from Egypt, Arsinoe didn't mourn her absence. She took the throne when Julius Caesar, the Roman general and statesman who would go on to become the most powerful man in Rome, arrived in Alexandria. It was Arsinoe who led an army against him, a teenage royal commanding real military force against him directly. She lost eventually. Arsinoe was captured and dragged to Rome, forced to march through the streets in chains as a captive of war. Accounts from the time describe something unexpected happening as the crowd watched her pass. Sympathy. enough to soften even a Roman audience. That public reaction is likely what spared her life. Instead of execution, she was sent into exile at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in what's now modern-day Turkey, sacred ground she likely believed would protect her permanently from her sister's reach. She was wrong about that too. In 41 BCE, at Cleopatra's own request, Mark Antony sent assassins directly to that temple, to a sanctuary that was supposed to be untouchable under religious law. They found Arsinoe there and killed her on its steps, a killing so brazen it scandalized the ancient world. A political murder carried out in a place violence wasn't supposed to be able to reach. For historians centuries later, that scandal left behind something valuable: a location. Everyone knew exactly where Arsinoe had died, which meant everyone knew exactly where to start looking for her remains.
Beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is, none other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe.
That search paid off, or seemed to, in 1929, when archaeologists excavating in Ephesus uncovered a striking, monumental tomb known as the octagon. Inside was a skeleton. Starting in the 1980s, scholars began building a theory around it, based on 3 overlapping details. The apparent age of the remains matched Arsinoe's age at death. The location matched exactly where she was known to have been killed, and the burial style matched what a royal exile's tomb should look like. If this was Arsinoe, it meant something far bigger than identifying one lost princess. It meant researchers finally had a direct genetic connection to Cleopatra's own family, a real physical link to her ethnicity and her lineage. For decades, this skeleton was treated as the closest thing science had to a window into the queen herself. Then, modern genetics finally got a real look at it. The skull in the octagon. For decades, that skeleton in the octagon sat treated as settled fact, one of the few genuine points of physical contact between modern archaeology and Cleopatra's own family line. But settling isn't the same as testing. And when researchers finally tried, the results didn't come easily. Early attempts at genetic analysis on the skeleton failed outright, compromised by contamination built up over decades of the bones simply being handled and studied by people who came before modern lab protocols existed. The sample that was supposed to answer everything couldn't answer anything at all. That changed in 2024 when a research team from the University of Vienna's Department of Evolutionary Anthropology, led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber, took another pass at the evidence. What made this attempt different wasn't just persistence. It was access to genetic sequencing technology precise enough to read damaged, degraded ancient DNA that older methods simply couldn't work with, paired with radiocarbon dating accurate enough to narrow down age within a few years rather than a few decades, and a full morphological re-examination of the bones themselves. But here's the catch. What they found didn't confirm 4 decades of assumption. It erased it. The skeleton carried a Y chromosome, not a woman's remains at all. A boy, somewhere between 11 and 14 years old at the time of death. Further examination only deepened the reversal. The skull showed severe developmental abnormalities, consistent with a genetic condition called Treacher-Collins syndrome, which affects the growth of facial bone and tissue. And the genetic markers recovered from the remains didn't trace back to Ptolemaic Egypt, or to Greece, or anywhere near the Mediterranean's eastern edge. They pointed toward the Italian peninsula, or Sardinia. That leaves a real, unanswered question sitting in its place. If this wasn't Arsinoe, who was this child? And why was he buried inside one of the most prestigious tombs in the ancient world at all? What the DNA actually found? That question of who this boy actually was may never get answered. But a different question, one about how an entire field got fooled for 40 years, actually does have an answer. 40 years is a long time for an entire field to build its understanding of a queen's family on a skeleton that turned out to belong to someone else completely. The obvious question isn't just what went wrong, it's how nobody caught it sooner. The honest answer is that everything about the original theory looked reasonable at the time, with the tools and evidence available. The age of the remains was consistent with Arsinoe's age at death. The location was, almost impossibly, exact. The same city, the same temple grounds where historical records placed her assassination. And the burial itself matched what researchers expected a royal exile's tomb to look like. Line those three things up next to each other, and it's easy to see why nobody pushed back sooner. Three separate lines of circumstantial evidence, all pointing the same direction, all reinforcing each other until the theory hardened into something closer to accepted fact than an open question. That's worth sitting with, because it's not really a story about bad science. Early genetic testing wasn't even possible in any reliable form back when. The theory first took hold in the 1980s. Nobody could have tested this claim properly at the time. The theory survived for decades, not because anyone was careless, but because the circumstantial case was genuinely strong enough to convince serious researchers, and there was no better tool available to check it against. That's exactly the trap worth naming directly, because it's the same one driving misinformation about Cleopatra right now. A story doesn't need to be true to spread. It just needs to be plausible enough and wanted badly enough that people stop asking whether anyone actually confirmed it. The correction, when it finally came, is in some ways the more interesting story. Not a myth being confirmed, but science actively catching and undoing its own 40-year-old mistake, the moment better tools finally made that possible. What this actually means: everything up to this point has been a real, verifiable trail of evidence, ending in a reversal 40 years in the making. But it's worth stopping here and being completely honest about what all of it actually adds up to, because this is exactly where a story like this usually gets stretched further than the evidence allows. Here's what this discovery actually proves. Modern genetic science is capable of dismantling a widely accepted historical identification that stood unchallenged in serious academic circles for over 4 decades, using nothing but a small sample of degraded ancient bone and the right sequencing technology. That's genuinely remarkable on its own terms, a field-wide assumption treated as close to settled fact, undone by a single test. But here's the catch. Here's what it doesn't prove, and this needs to be said plainly rather than left implied. Nothing about this discovery confirms, denies, or touches Cleopatra herself in any way. Not her appearance, not her ancestry, not her health. This is a mistaken identity story about a boy who, once the assumption is stripped away, was never actually connected to her at all. He isn't her sister. He isn't even from the same part of the world her family came from. He's simply a person whose bones happen to occupy a tomb that scholars, for 40 years, badly wanted to belong to someone else. Any claim built on top of this discovery that it somehow reveals Cleopatra's true ethnicity, her real appearance, some hidden genetic secret about the queen herself, isn't drawing a conclusion from the evidence. It's borrowing the drama of a real scientific reversal and quietly reattaching it to a person this discovery never actually touched. The question that's still open, so where does that leave the actual search? 2 open doors, and neither one has a clear answer yet. Kathleen Martínez is still digging. 20 years in, a tunnel, a submerged port, 16 tombs full of gold-tongued dead behind her, she's arguably closer to Cleopatra's real resting place than anyone in modern history. Whether that's close enough, and how much longer it takes, is genuinely unknown. There's no timeline for when, or whether, that tomb gets opened. But even reaching the end of that tunnel wouldn't automatically settle things. There's a second open question too, separate from the excavation itself. If Martínez's team eventually does find human remains at Taposiris Magna, The same question that undid the Arsinoe theory will apply immediately. Does the evidence actually support who researchers want it to be, or does it just look close enough to be convincing? Nothing about this search is guaranteed to end cleanly, even once something is finally found. For now, both doors remain exactly where they've been. The tunnel, still unopened at its end. The tomb, still unfound. Cleopatra's DNA did tell a terrifying story, just not the one anyone expected. 40 years of accepted history collapsed over a single skeleton, the queen's own sister replaced by a stranger nobody had ever heard of. If an entire field can be wrong for 40 years about whose bones they were holding, what makes anyone certain about the ones still buried?